Hello, and welcome to this episode of Breaking Down the Network Chains. Today, we're going to talk about something that's not necessarily networking, but it goes into that whole hybrid architecture that we talked about in the last video, and that's backup and disaster recovery. I'm Dwayne Natwick. I'm a Microsoft Azure MVP and a cloud training architect at Opsagility and Skill Me Up. I also am an MCT and a regional lead for that program. I have multiple Azure and Microsoft 365 certifications, and you can find me on the links provided on the slide. So we're coming to the end of the topics that I laid out for this series of YouTube videos. And we have one more after this. And as I stated in one of the previous videos, I have already made some plans on what my next series is going to be, and we're going to focus on a little bit more deeper dive into security services within Azure, and then following that, we're going to go into the Microsoft 365 world as well. So today we're hitting on one of our last two sessions, and that's backup and disaster recovery. And as I was saying, this isn't necessarily, we're kind of moving into our defense in depth security posture a little bit deeper than the security aspects that we've talked about throughout this series, where we've been talking a lot about perimeter and network security. We're getting a little bit more into compute applications and data security in this rather than networking, but there's some things to think about in terms of backup and disaster recovery that has to do with your network and how you're architecting within the Azure and the hybrid environments, and that's what we'll focus on here in the slides, as well as when we talk about in the demo how we're connecting to our hybrid architectures. So the first thing we'll talk about a little bit is Azure Backup, and great thing about Azure Backup is it is a Azure-based backup service. It has a 99.9% service availability, but has local and geo-redundant storage available. So that adds a little bit to the resiliency and availability of the environment if you configure it to that level. You have data transit in data encryption in transit and at rest. And these are application consistent backups. So if you're doing a backup snapshot of your virtual machine, you are getting an application consistent backup. It's not just the data. So when you restore that backup, it's going to restore all your configuration of your application as well. That's very helpful for your recovery time objective. And something we didn't hit on, and I probably should have put a slide on this, is when we're talking about backup and business continuity and disaster recovery, there's two things that we talk about: the recovery point objectives and the recovery time objectives, or RPO and RTO. The RTO is the time that it takes to recover from a disaster or from a outage of a virtual machine, for example. And then the RPO, or recovery point objective, is how much data and information is lost by that outage. And you need to, as an organization, take those both into account in terms of what your organization is willing to bear in terms of both of those recovery objectives, and how much revenue might be lost on an extended recovery time or an extended recovery point. If you lose data for 24 hours, is that going to sink your entire business? And that's going to determine how much you're going to invest in backup as well as disaster recovery. And when we talk, and what you're willing to do in terms of hot sites and cool sites and things like that in terms of backup. And we could talk all day on backup, but as you know, these videos are meant to be quick and short, but will also probably hit in my Azure security series a little bit deeper dive on RTO and RPO. But the key thing here is that the Azure Backup features do provide backup scenarios for both Azure resources as well as on-premise and physical and virtual servers. So that's a key point when we're talking about networking and how our hybrid connections work that we were talking about in terms of VPN gateways 2 videos ago, as well as the hybrid connections that we talked about in the last video. So how does Azure Backup work? There's multiple ways that Azure Backup works. The easiest way for Azure Backup is the Azure Backup agent, or the Mars agent. That works on Windows machines, virtual machines running on Hyper-V or VMware. And it's just an agent that runs and can push that information right to your Recovery Services Vault. Recovery Services Vault is very important to both backup and Azure Site Recovery. And we will go through in our demo how you set up your Recovery Services Vault and how you can manage your backups as well as your disaster recovery jobs within the Recovery Services Vault. Some key points around this, though, is if you are running a combination of Windows and Linux virtual machines within your environment, you can, or you want to back up a SQL server or SharePoint or Exchange server within your environment, you're going to need to have a backup server or be running Windows System Center with Data Protection Manager the Data Protection Management module installed. So that's a key point around that. You can only really back up Windows devices, and you can see here, if you follow the lines here, you can see that for the Mars agent, it points to the Windows PCs as well as the physical servers that are Windows. And for Linux, you're going to be requiring that backup server and as well as or the System Center with Data Protection Manager, which does essentially the same thing as Azure Backup Server. So you can create a backup server if you don't have System Center. If you have System Center, you can just enable that Data Protection Manager within your System Center servers, and then have that availability to back up your Linux environments, as well as some Microsoft specific purpose-built servers such as SQL, SharePoint, and Exchange if you're still running those on premises. This kind of just takes it a little bit further here. You can see what's supported in terms of Azure VMs, both in the Azure environment. We have Azure VMs, we have SQL Server on VMs, SAP HANA, as well as Azure Files within the Azure only environment. So that's something to understand. Within Azure, you have actually less services that you can support in terms of backup, mainly because backup is a IaaS. Azure Backup is typically an IaaS built service within Azure. Many of the other services, if you're running PaaS services, have backup and high availability built in that you can configure, and that's all in the back end. You don't necessarily need the Recovery Services Vault in your environment to utilize them. Now let's talk briefly about site recovery before we jump into the portal. And site recovery is the disaster recovery solution within the Azure environment, and it provides both on-premises to the cloud, cloud to on-premises, as well as cloud to cloud, as well as on-premises to on-premises. It can be utilized as a means in the middle to between a hot site and a cool site of your business continuity plans. It can be used as that disaster recovery mechanism to move from your production site to your disaster recovery site as well. There's a lot of configuration that needs to go, and as we talk about networking, you're going to need to make sure when we're doing on-premises type disaster recovery solutions, as with backup, is that you do take into account what your network speeds are, because those are going to have a very strong bearing on your recovery time objective. One of the nice things about Azure Backup and recovering virtual machines in Azure Backup to your on-premises environment is that the transmission within Azure Backup for recovery is not chargeable within the Azure environment, which is a little bit different from any other of the services where you aren't charged for ingress, but you're charged for egress. There is no egress charge when you're utilizing Azure Backup services. So when you're architecting Azure Site Recovery, again, important things to think about is, what workload are you protecting? What is your source and your target? And what is the change rate from on-premises to on-premises, from on-premises to cloud, or from Azure region to region if you're doing Azure to Azure Site Recovery? And then what are you physically backing up? Are they Azure VMs? Are they VMware Hyper-V VMs? Are they physical servers that you're going to be backing up on premises? So those are some things to think about when you're architecting for site recovery. And here's just a diagram that kind of shows a utilization of Hyper-V as well as VMware. The big architectural difference between the two is Hyper-V has some synchronization tools for our Azure Site Recovery built into Hyper-V, since it is a Microsoft product. With VMware, you actually need to run a synchronization type server which can just be a VM in your on-premises environment that handles that synchronization between Azure Site Recovery from the on-premises of really what the configuration is and any changes in that configuration. So when you initiate a disaster and execute Azure Site Recovery, it moves over smoothly and you don't have any configuration issues. And this goes a little bit further in this diagram and showing that config server and that process server that you're going to need within a VMware environment, and what you're going to need to do in terms of having that target environment for VMware to the data channel that's going to the process server for failback within the Microsoft environment. So, a little bit more configuration and architecture in a VMware environment than if you're using Hyper-V. This is going to be probably typically what you're going to see in a lot of enterprises, because most enterprises are utilizing VMware. From a networking standpoint, making sure you have strong network connections, having an express route like we talked about in the hybrid connection video is extremely important, so that because that's going to affect your recovery time objective in terms of recovering your backup jobs, as well as if you're failing over your entire data center to an Azure environment or to another hot or cool site, you're going to need to have a strong, potentially dedicated connection if you have a large enterprise architecture. So let's go into the portal real quick and take a look at how we're going to set up our Recovery Services Vault and what goes into creating a backup job, as well as what goes into creating our recovery services job for an on-premises data center. Now we're in our Azure portal. So the first thing that we're always going to do in terms of backup or disaster recovery is we need to set up a Recovery Services Vault. So we're going to go to Recovery Services Vault, and let's set up our Recovery Services Vault here now. I don't have one set up. I do have a resource group that I can put it into, and I'm going to just name it Recovery, and we're going to create. You can see here it gives a little message here that there is a default storage type is set to geo-redundant storage, which is good, because now we have that set up, and soft delete is also enabled. Was another message that was on that screen there. So important to know, especially if you're going to remove resources, that soft delete feature can cause some headaches in terms of removing resources, because it won't delete your Recovery Services Vault by just removing your resource group. So if you're doing a development type environment or a short-term proof of concept type environment, and you go to remove a resource group that has a Recovery Services Vault created, you may have an issue if you have backups within that environment. You're going to have to delete the backups, and then you're going to have to remove that soft delete to those backups so that all that information is removed if you don't need it anymore. But it's a good, from a resiliency and recovery standpoint and protection standpoint, that's a good feature, because you don't want somebody going in and accidentally deleting or purposefully deleting all of your backup jobs. So that soft delete feature avoids that issue. You still have that second layer. You still have that second layer of recovery if somebody goes in and maliciously removes those backups or does it by accident. So let's go to our Recovery Services Vault. And here we can see we have backup and site recovery both within here to get started. Now, if you're doing backup for virtual machines, you can get there and back up a virtual machine from the virtual machine itself. There is a backup within the menu to get that going. But if you're setting up your overall resiliency environment and high availability backup environment, you can do that all within the Recovery Services Vault as well. The easiest thing to do is when you get to your overview page, just hit Get Started. And you can see here, it's going to tell you here again that our replication is set to geo-redundant. It cannot be changed later. If you want to change it to just locally redundant, you can change it now. But if you create your backup job as geo-redundant, you're obviously going to have a backup locally as well as in another region. So keep that in mind. And that's going to be a cost involved in that, because you're increasing your storage. So keep that in mind. It's always a good best practice, and that's why it's defaulted to geo-redundant, to have multiple sets of your backup. And here we got where is our workload running, and you can see you have your choices of Azure Stack or on-premises. If we pick on-premises, you can see we have multiple capabilities here in terms of files and folders on a file server. You have your Hyper-V and VMware VMs, SQL Server, SharePoint, Exchange, and then here's your system state or bare metal for physical devices. If we go into our Azure, again, like we mentioned in the slides, we have our virtual machine, Azure File Share SQL Server on in an IaaS type environment. So if you have a SQL server that's on a virtual machine, you're not using the PaaS services. And then also SAP HANA has been added recently to this, to the backup jobs. If we go into Azure Stack, you can look at Azure Stack, and there's a limit here as well. So based on what we have potentially on our Azure Stack edge, we could have files and folders, SQL Server, SharePoint, as well as system state within the Azure Stack environment. So let's select on-premise, and let's pick a VMware virtual machine here. And here it says prepare infrastructure. So we're going to select our infrastructure here, and you can see here it will ask us, are we using System Center Data Protection Manager or any System Center product already, and it will tell us that. So what I wanted to show here, and we're not going to go too far because I don't have a VMware environment, but it steps you through everything. And that's what's nice here. You can download here the backup server installation and get your backup server ready, and go from there with all of your going through the step-by-step in terms of creating your backup job for your on-premises system. If we were to go back to our backup job and pick a virtual machine in Azure, it's very easy here because we can add our virtual machines and see our virtual machines right within the Azure portal and select them for backup, and it will put the backup agent right on those virtual machines. So a little bit more configuration involved with an on-premises type environment, but it's also provides a wizard to step you through as well. So if you're new to Azure Backup, it does step you through that process and help you out. So the last thing I wanted to show is the site recovery. So if we go get started on site recovery, and again, you can see down here, you got your 3 scenarios in this overview of, are we doing Azure virtual machines? Are we doing virtual VMware machines to Azure? So is it a VMware environment on premises, or Hyper-V machines to Azure? So we can then take a look here of just enabling replication. It's very easy to get Azure Site Recovery going in an Azure to Azure environment. But if we're on premises and we have a VMware environment, again, we have our prepare infrastructure. And it's going to ask us, have we done our deployment planning? And we have here where we can download and deploy our deployment planner. If we want to just skip through there and say, I'll do it later, you can click I'll do it later and click next. You can see here, if you're looking to migrate your virtual machines, it actually puts you right in Azure Migrate. For a while, Microsoft was actually promoting using Azure Site Recovery as a migration tool as well, as they evolved Azure Migrate a little bit more. Now they got Azure Migrate in a situation where they're recommending that as your migration tool now, where before Site Recovery was a valid use of to be a valid use for a migration tool. So you could go right to Azure Migrate here if you're doing a migration. But what we're doing here is we are doing disaster recovery. So we want to click next, and here we can set our source settings, our virtual machines. Virtualized, we can add our config server. Like I was saying, for a virtual machine environment, you need to have that configuration server in your process server. We can create that in here. In terms of your configuration server, what it's going to do here is it's going to give you the VMware virtual machine package to create a VM in your VMware System Center. To create a VM in your VMware vCenter for your virtual machine, and with this OVF template. And once you do that, then you're ready to step through the other steps. So I'm not going to go any further on this, but you can see here that within the prepare the infrastructure, it steps you through the entire process. And that's really what I wanted to point out, is it's very easy from a standpoint of understanding to be able to utilize the Azure portal to create a recovery services job and essentially get a disaster recovery site up and running rather quickly, rather than having to pick a data center, choose your data center, choose your, rent a data center or a co-loc location, rent space, buy a, get a rack, get the equipment purchased, configure that equipment for your disaster recovery environment for what you need. It could be a very expensive capital investment to your environment, where Azure Site Recovery is ready to go. You can get a essentially warm/hot site available that costs very little until you initiate a disaster recovery. Till you execute your disaster recovery, it does not cost that much. It's a warm site ready to go with all the virtual machine and compute power that you need to have everything moving forward and ready to install. So that ends this video today. I want to thank you for joining me in this video series. It's been really fun, and I look forward to providing the last video of this series and then moving into my next series as well. Feel free to follow me on the social media links provided on this slide, and have a great day.